In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. I thought I'd step aside from today's lectionary texts and say something more general about the gospel that dominates this year's sequence of readings, St. Matthew's. When we begin the cycle of the year in Advent, we're right into the story of Jesus' life, and we run with it for 6 months, tied to its unfolding narrative. And only now, slightly more than halfway through the Church's year, can we pause and learn a bit of the background to this quite lengthy text of 28 chapters that has been guiding us through one version of our founding story. Scholars trying to help us to understand a document like this have a toolkit with all sorts of clever devices in it. They might be able to narrow down when the document was written. So if a historical event week and date is mentioned, we know the text can't be any earlier than that date. They can sometimes spot when the text has been edited by someone other than the author, because perhaps the two use very different literary styles. Maybe they use a different word to refer to God, or simply contradict each other. Think of the two very different accounts of creation in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Or they might be able to spot the sources the author has used, and that's quite easy with parts of Matthew that seem to be almost perfect lifts out of Mark's shorter gospel. Well, with those techniques and many more, the experts tell us that Matthew's gospel was probably written between the years 70 and 100 AD, and was probably written in and for a Christian community that had in it lots of people who were originally Jewish, possibly living a little way outside what we would call the Holy Land. The temple then had recently been destroyed. The Pharisee party had become totally dominant because their focus had always been the law more than the temple, so obviously they were better able to survive that catastrophe, and so they posed the greatest threat to the new faith. And that places the writing of this book a generation or so after people like St. Paul and St. Peter wrestled painfully with the question whether it was possible for people to be Christians who were not Jewish. And fortunately for us, that debate was resolved in favour of all of us being able to be part of Jesus' movement that we now call the Church. But I guess the question must have been asked the other way round to those who actually were Jewish. Was this new way of life following Christ really a proper Jewish thing to do, or something completely new? To become followers of the Christian way, were they having to leave the faith of their ancestors, of their childhood? That would be a really big deal. That would be a very hard decision. Christ's teaching, the new way he offered to his followers, started off as a movement certainly within his own Jewish faith. You see him and his disciples going back and forth to the temple. Indeed, his friends make a beeline back there to worship even after the ascension on some tellings. And it's a kind of a gradual separation after that that develops Christianity into a religion completely separate from Judaism. And that process is happening at the time that Matthew's Gospel is being written. One of the tools scholars use to understand the writing of a biblical book is to look at the form the document takes. What kind of literature is it? The order in which things are discussed, the connection made between different ideas. And if you stand quite a long way back from Matthew's Gospel and skim read it really quickly so that you don't get caught up in the detail of it, you'll find yourself looking at a very distinctive shape of the overall story. Now, there are exceptions along the way to what I'm about to say, but generally speaking, here is the arc of the narrative going right up to the point just before the Passion narrative begins. At first, this is a story about Jesus as a figure within his Jewish faith. We get his Jewish genealogy in chapter 1. The Christmas story is the wise men bit, but really it's the story of the reaction of the Jewish ruler Herod to a new threat. Then in the story of Jesus' baptism and the calling of the first disciples, there are constant references back to the Old Testament as his authority. The Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 to 7 starts as a dialogue between Jesus and the Jewish law. Over and over again you hear him say, "You have heard do this, but I say do that." Then there's a sequence of stories of miracles in which Jesus pushes the boundaries of the tradition, healing a woman, the child of a Roman soldier, a demon-possessed man, all people who couldn't get anywhere near the middle of temple worship. And then in chapter 10, Jesus warns his friends about the backlash they can expect as they start to live out this new way, and sure enough it begins. There's a series of aggressive encounters with very cross religious experts, culminating in the murder of John the Baptist in prison. And then in chapter 15, there's that rather stunning story of the Canaanite woman, now there's a marginal character in all sorts of ways, who stands up to Jesus and says the dogs can eat the crumbs that fall from the children's dinner table. And now the teaching is about the kingdom of heaven, not about the Jewish law. Now the authority figures are the disciples who are going to be sent out as the apostles to the whole world before very long. And then in episodes like the Transfiguration and Holy Week and Easter, Jesus has his own glory for those who have eyes to see it. He has come out from the shadow of the characters of the Hebrew Bible. There is a different light about the latter part of Matthew's writing compared with the earlier chapters, because its readers have been taken on a journey of ideas that has taken them from one mindset to another new one. Now imagine reading that gospel in that order in a Jewish Christian enclave somewhere in the Eastern Roman Empire. The gospel is telling that community its own story, is reflecting to it its bruising emergence into its own identity as the Church of Jesus Christ. Before you zero in on any of its individual stories, this is a gospel that is saying a clear yes to the readership that was in the author's mind. Now, if you're going to put together a telling of the good news of Jesus, and you want to address the questions of who is part of the church and who isn't, there are other ways you could do it. You could instead address the people whose inclusion was in doubt in the first place, which in this historical case would be the non-Jewish Christians, and you would reassure them that they belonged no matter what they might be hearing to the contrary. Or you could address the people who were doing the excluding and tear a strip off them for the way they were behaving, and I suppose that's what Paul was doing in the letter to the Galatians, where he really gets pretty grumpy about that kind of excluding behaviour. But how sensitive and loving it is to address yourself, as Matthew does, to the people who are having to make huge, dangerous, life-altering religious decisions to step into something new along with people they never thought they could possibly include and break bread with all the risk and rejection that would involve for them in that world. To address them with a telling of Jesus' story that shows that it is what their story is also meant to be like. And we're still doing that as the church. We're still finding people we should not have been excluding. And as we speak the welcome that they should have been hearing long before now, we need also to speak to those whose religious comfort zone we are going to bulldoze to make room for the new arrivals. And it takes generations to do it, just as it did back then. It's about race. The reaction to the death of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis calls all of society, and not least the church, to practice what it preaches about Black Lives Mattering. And in Scotland, we don't think we're racist, but it's only because we've had so little immigration compared with other places that our prejudices have not been threatened much. It's about gender. The battle for women's ordination has been won in so many denominations, including ours, with only pockets of rearguard resistance to embarrass us from time to time. And yet it's not like that everywhere. It's about sexuality. Here the churches are at very different points on that journey of change. Our Church of Scotland has just passed the tipping point in the last few years, I think. And by that I mean we're still a very divided denomination, but most people on both sides of the debate now recognise that the future is certain to be one of increasing liberalisation and increasing safety for our LGBT plus members. But those are big categories which the church thinks about corporately and makes decisions centrally for us all to follow. I suspect there are other ways in which you and I, as individual followers of Jesus Christ, have to listen to the message of Matthew's Gospel and take courage to be part of a community that is larger than we might have expected it to be. And it can be hard to do that. When it's about you sharing your worship space with someone who has not recovered from a messy addiction, or someone who has hurt a member of your family in an unedifying divorce battle, or someone everyone knows you fell out with and never fixed that breakage, it's going to take so much grace that it's going to need sheer courage for you to hold out that difficult welcome. It will not only be the other person who will need to hear a reassuring word of Jesus as his arm encircles them. Actually, you or I are also going to need to hear him say, "It's okay. That's what I meant." For St. Matthew's Gospel running through our lives this year, thanks be to God.